November 8, 1942, outside Oran, Algeria, Obergefreiter Hans Dietrich pressed himself into the North African sand as incoming fire chewed up the ground around his position. The sound was wrong. That was his first coherent thought as bullets snapped overhead with mechanical precision. German rifles and machine guns had a rhythm he knew intimately after 3 years of war. Pause between shots for bolt action, bursts from machine guns. But this incoming fire was continuous, relentless, individual rifles firing as fast as machine guns, without the pause to reload. Dietrich raised his head cautiously to identify the shooters. Through the dust and smoke, he saw American infantry advancing, their rifles barking with impossible speed. Each soldier fired 8 shots in the time Dietrich needed to chamber 5 rounds in his carabiner 98K. The Americans weren't even skilled marksmen. They were firing from the hip while advancing, but volume compensated for accuracy. The mathematical superiority was overwhelming. What Dietrich was experiencing in those first minutes of combat against American forces would become the defining tactical shock for German infantry throughout the war. The Wehrmacht had spent 3 years perfecting warfare with bolt-action rifles and careful ammunition conservation. The Americans had brought a completely different philosophy to the battlefield. Semi-automatic rifles that fired as fast as you could pull the trigger, automatic weapons distributed throughout infantry squads, ammunition supplied so abundantly that conservation wasn't necessary. The German army had prepared to fight the last war. The Americans had brought the next war, and the difference would be measured in firepower ratios that made German infantry doctrine obsolete. The story of German forces encountering American firearms superiority reveals one of World War II's most decisive technological and tactical advantages. It wasn't exotic wonder weapons or strategic innovations that gave American infantry their edge. It was simple mathematics. More bullets fired faster with less effort equaled more enemies suppressed or killed per soldier. The Germans understood infantry tactics superbly, but American firepower rendered German tactical excellence increasingly irrelevant. You cannot maneuver when suppressed by overwhelming fire. You cannot aim carefully when incoming rounds never stop. The Americans had industrialized infantry combat, and the Germans discovered that craftsmanship couldn't compete with mass production backed by unlimited ammunition. To understand the shock German soldiers experienced when facing American firepower, one must first comprehend Wehrmacht infantry doctrine and equipment in 1942. The standard German infantry rifle was the carabiner 98K, a bolt-action weapon derived from designs dating to 1898. It was accurate, reliable, and required the shooter to manually cycle the bolt between each shot. A skilled German soldier could fire 15 aimed shots per minute. Elite troops might achieve 20, but each shot required deliberate action. Acquire target, aim, fire, work bolt, eject spent cartridge, chamber new round, aim again, fire. The process was second nature to trained infantry, but it imposed fundamental limitations on rate of fire. German squad tactics were built around this bolt-action limitation. The squad's firepower came primarily from the MG-34 or MG-42 machine gun operated by a specialized 2-man team. The riflemen existed mainly to protect the machine gun and exploit opportunities the machine gun created. This concentrated firepower in a single weapon system that was devastating when properly employed, but vulnerable when suppressed or destroyed. German infantry doctrine emphasized discipline, marksmanship, and tactical movement. Fire and maneuver, suppress the enemy with machine gun fire while riflemen advanced to better positions. It worked brilliantly when facing enemies with similar capabilities, but it assumed the enemy operated under similar constraints. The American M1 Garand rifle shattered those assumptions. Adopted in 1936, the Garand was the world's first standard-issue semi-automatic infantry rifle. Gas-operated, it automatically loaded a new round after each shot. The soldier simply aimed and pulled the trigger again. No bolt to work, no manual cycling. The Garand held 8 rounds in an internal clip that ejected automatically when empty, producing a distinctive ping that became famous. A competent American soldier could fire all 8 rounds in under 10 seconds. Aimed fire rates of 40 to 50 rounds per minute were common. This was 3 times the sustained fire rate of German bolt-action rifles. But raw fire rate was only part of the story. The Garand's semi-automatic action meant the shooter never lost their sight picture. German riflemen had to break aim to work the bolt, reacquiring the target for each shot. American riflemen kept their sights on target continuously, firing as fast as they could pull the trigger while maintaining aim. This translated to faster engagement of multiple targets and more effective suppressive fire. A single American rifleman could keep an enemy position suppressed in ways that required multiple German riflemen coordinating their fire. The Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, distributed automatic fire throughout American squads in ways German doctrine couldn't match. The BR was essentially a portable light machine gun that could be fired from the shoulder. It held 20 rounds and could fire fully automatic at 350 rounds per minute or semi-automatic for more precise shooting. Each American infantry squad had 1 or 2 BARs, meaning every squad had automatic weapons. German squads had 1 machine gun that required a 2-man team and a bipod or tripod for effective use. The bar could be fired while advancing, providing covering fire during movement. The M1918 Browning machine gun provided American infantry with heavy firepower that exceeded German capabilities. Firing the same .30-06 ammunition as the Garand and BAR, the Browning could sustain fire rates of 450 rounds per minute. It was reliable, rarely jamming even in harsh conditions. Most importantly, American doctrine and logistics ensured machine gun crews never lacked ammunition, while German machine gunners were trained to fire short, aimed bursts to conserve ammunition. American gunners were encouraged to maintain sustained fire. Suppression through volume was the American approach. The mathematics of firepower became stark when comparing squad capabilities. A standard German infantry squad in 1942 consisted of 10 men with 9 Kar-98K rifles and 1 MG-34 machine gun. Assuming skilled troops, the riflemen could collectively fire 150 aimed rounds per minute. The machine gun, if properly employed and supplied, could add 800 rounds per minute. Total squad firepower, approximately 950 rounds per minute, concentrated in one weapon system. An American infantry squad consisted of 12 men with 11 M1 Garands, 1 or 2 BARs, and attached machine gun support. The Garand riflemen could collectively fire 440 aimed rounds per minute. The bars added 350 to 700 rounds per minute, depending on whether 1 or 2 were present. Machine gun support added another 450 rounds per minute. Total squad firepower ranged from 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute, distributed across multiple weapon systems. The Americans had 40 to 60% more firepower per squad, and that firepower was harder to suppress because it didn't depend on a single weapon. The ammunition difference was even more dramatic. German infantry carried 60 rounds per rifleman, 250 rounds per machine gunner. The squad carried approximately 790 rounds total. Ammunition resupply was irregular, and soldiers were trained to conserve ammunition carefully. Running out of ammunition during combat was a constant concern. American infantry carried 80 rounds per Garand rifleman, 300 rounds per bar operator, and machine gunners had access to thousands of rounds from attached support. The squad carried over 2,000 rounds immediately available, with more readily accessible from supply networks that made ammunition scarcity almost unknown. Hans Dietrich discovered these realities firsthand during that first firefight outside Oran. His squad had taken position behind a low ridge, preparing to engage the advancing Americans. The plan was standard German doctrine. The MG-34 would open fire to suppress the enemy. Riflemen would advance using terrain for cover. Maneuver would decide the engagement. But when the MG-34 opened fire, American return fire was immediate and overwhelming. Not from one machine gun, but from a dozen rifles and multiple automatic weapons. The volume was stunning. The MG-34 gunner was hit within seconds before he could fire more than one burst. Without the machine gun, the German riflemen were outgunned. Dietrich tried to return fire with his Kar 98K. He aimed at an American soldier, fired, worked the bolt, aimed again. By the time he had chambered his second round, the American had fired 6 times. Dietrich's position was hit by rounds from multiple directions. He couldn't identify individual shooters because the fire was continuous. He hugged the sand, unable to raise his head long enough to aim. This was suppression more complete than anything he had experienced facing British or Soviet forces. The Americans weren't necessarily better shots. They simply fired so many more rounds that accuracy became less important than volume. The American advance continued under covering fire that never slackened. German survivors described it as a wall of bullets moving forward. You couldn't move, you couldn't aim, you couldn't even think clearly under that barrage. Dietrich's squad suffered 50% casualties in under 5 minutes. The survivors withdrew in disorder, having inflicted minimal damage on the Americans. Dietrich had fired perhaps 12 rounds from his 60-round loadout. The Americans had fired hundreds. The mathematical superiority translated directly to tactical dominance. German after-action reports from North Africa repeatedly cited American firepower superiority as a decisive factor. Wehrmacht officers who had fought on the Eastern Front noted that American infantry fire was heavier than anything Soviet forces produced. The Red Army emphasized massed attacks and artillery, but their infantry firearms were similar to German weapons. Bolt-action rifles, limited automatic weapons, careful ammunition conservation. The Americans were different. They fought with industrial abundance that German logistics couldn't match. The firepower differential extended beyond small arms to supporting weapons. American 60mm mortars were organic to infantry companies, providing immediate indirect fire support. The M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun was distributed throughout American units, offering devastating long-range firepower and even light anti-armor capability. American infantry had access to anti-tank weapons, bazookas, that individual soldiers could employ. German infantry relied more heavily on specialized anti-tank units and artillery support that wasn't always available. But technology alone didn't explain American firepower dominance. Training and doctrine emphasized aggressive fire. American infantry were trained to advance while firing, using suppression to enable movement. German infantry were trained to advance using cover and concealment, minimizing exposure. The American approach required more ammunition but was faster and often more effective. The Germans excelled at tactical movement but struggled when overwhelming fire prevented that movement. The psychological impact on German soldiers was profound. Veterans of the Eastern Front had developed confidence in their tactical superiority over Soviet infantry. They had learned that disciplined fire and maneuver could defeat numerically superior enemies. Facing Americans shattered that confidence. The Americans didn't need superior tactics. They had superior firepower that made tactics less relevant. German soldiers described feeling helpless under American fire. Training and experience meant little when you couldn't raise your head to shoot back. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 temporarily restored German confidence. Inexperienced American forces were badly handled by veteran Afrika Korps units. But even in defeat, American firepower impressed German veterans. One German officer noted that American infantry fought poorly, but their weapons fought superbly. If American soldiers gained experience to match their equipment, they would be formidable. That prediction proved accurate. By Sicily in July 1943, American infantry combined improved tactics with their firepower advantage, creating forces that routinely defeated equivalent German units. The Italian campaign from 1943 to 1945 demonstrated sustained American firepower dominance across varied terrain and conditions. At Monte Cassino, Anzio, and throughout the Gothic line, German defenders prepared elaborate fortifications, expecting to inflict heavy casualties on American attacks. The fortifications were well designed and stubbornly defended, but American infantry tactics evolved to maximize their firepower advantage. Base of fire elements would suppress German positions with overwhelming automatic weapons fire, while maneuver elements flanked. The Germans couldn't suppress American formations because distributed firepower meant no single target could neutralize American offensive capability. German defensive doctrine emphasized counterattacks to throw attackers off balance. This worked against forces with similar firepower because both sides needed to pause, regroup, and resupply before resuming offensive action. American firepower superiority meant less need for pauses. They could maintain pressure continuously, firing, advancing, firing again without the ammunition concerns that forced German units to carefully manage their loadouts. The relentlessness was demoralizing. German defenders knew that American attacks would continue regardless of casualties because American replacements, ammunition, and supplies were apparently unlimited. The Normandy invasion in June 1944 brought the firepower differential to its ultimate test. German forces defending the beaches had prepared for years, creating interlocking fields of fire designed to annihilate amphibious assaults. At Omaha Beach, these defenses worked horrifyingly well during the initial landings, but American firepower eventually prevailed through sheer volume. Destroyers closed to shore and fired directly at German positions. Infantry that reached cover began suppressing bunkers with rifle and automatic weapons fire heavy enough to allow engineers to advance and destroy fortifications. The firepower that American forces could concentrate on individual targets exceeded what German defenders had experienced or prepared for. The bocage fighting in Normandy after the breakout demonstrated American firepower advantages in close-quarters combat. The hedgerow country of Normandy negated long-range advantages and forced fighting at ranges where German tactical skill should have dominated. But American squads could pour more fire into hedgerows than Germans could return. The bar was particularly effective in bocage fighting, allowing fire and movement that kept Germans suppressed while other elements maneuvered. German after-action reports noted that American aggressiveness increased as their troops gained experience. Early in Normandy, Americans were cautious. By August, they were advancing continuously, using firepower to overwhelm any opposition. The German response to American firepower superiority revealed the limits of adaptation. Wehrmacht planners understood they were outgunned at the infantry level. They attempted various solutions. Increase machine gun distribution to squads, develop semi-automatic rifles, improve ammunition logistics, train soldiers to fire faster with bolt-action rifles. None succeeded fully. Germany's industrial capacity couldn't match American small arms production. Resources went to tanks, aircraft, and artillery rather than infantry weapons. Semi-automatic rifle programs like the Gewehr 43 produced only tens of thousands of units versus millions of Garands. German ammunition production could barely maintain current loadouts, much less increase them to American levels. Tactical adaptations were equally limited. German doctrine emphasized defensive economy of force, using terrain and fortifications to multiply effectiveness. This worked to reduce casualties, but couldn't overcome firepower differentials in mobile operations. German commanders noted that American infantry would simply suppress defensive positions with overwhelming fire while calling in artillery and air support. The combination of direct fire superiority and supporting arms dominance made static defense increasingly futile. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 showed what German forces could accomplish with surprise and favorable conditions. Initial attacks achieved tactical success against unprepared American units, but even during the Bulge, German infantry struggled in direct combat against prepared American defenders. At Bastogne, surrounded American forces repelled repeated German attacks through firepower that German infantry couldn't match. The 101st Airborne and attached units defending Bastogne had sufficient ammunition and automatic weapons to maintain defensive fires that broke up German attacks. German attackers suffered casualties that American defenders did not, purely due to firepower imbalances. Hans Dietrich survived the war, surrendering to American forces in Germany in April 1945. In post-war interviews, he reflected on his experience facing American infantry from North Africa through the final defense of Germany. Their weapons weren't wonder weapons or secret technology. They were just better than ours. They could fire more rounds, faster, with less effort. Their soldiers had ammunition to spare. We rationed every bullet. That difference mattered more than tactics or training. When one side can fire 60 rounds for every 10 you fire, they win. It's simple mathematics. The story of German forces encountering American firearms superiority reveals that wars are won not through wonder weapons, but through practical advantages multiplied across entire armies. The M1 Garand wasn't a revolutionary technology. It was simply a well-engineered semi-automatic rifle produced in millions of units and supplied with unlimited ammunition. The bar wasn't exotic. It was an automatic rifle distributed throughout infantry squads. The Browning machine guns weren't secret weapons. They were reliable, effective, and available in quantities German industry couldn't match. These simple, practical advantages combined to create firepower dominance that rendered German tactical excellence increasingly irrelevant. When Germany first encountered American guns firing with such devastating volume, they discovered that industrial warfare rewarded mass production backed by abundant resources more than it rewarded craft production constrained by scarcity. The Germans had built an army around bolt-action rifles because that's what their industry could supply in quantity. The Americans built an army around semi-automatic rifles because their industry could supply anything in quantity. The difference wasn't technological sophistication, it was industrial capacity translated into battlefield effectiveness. And that difference was measured in bullets fired per minute, in soldiers who survived firefights, and ultimately in victory achieved through overwhelming material advantage that no amount of skill or courage could overcome.